In the darkness, an old grain barge moved toward a hole in the dike. Beyond that breach lay farms, towns, and one of the most densely populated regions in Europe. The captain had been asked to do something no ship was built to do: crash into the land and stay there. To understand why one old ship mattered so much, we have to go back 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, this land was not a country. It was a delta where several rivers, including the Rhine, met the sea. Rain, tides, and floods shaped a low, wet, spongy ground of marsh and peat. Nothing here stood high enough to stay dry for long. Roman writers, including Pliny the Elder, viewed these communities as poor and vulnerable. Pliny wrote of people living on muddy mounds, surrounded by water whenever the tide came in. To Roman eyes, their lives looked miserable. But those mounds were not a sign of helplessness. They were called terpen, and they were the first Dutch answer to water. Families raised their homes above the highest tides, not with stone or steel, but with soil, carried and packed by hand, basket after basket. Villages, and later small churches, rose on top of these man-made hills. Hundreds of them still stand today. No one gave them this land. They built it, one basket of earth at a time. It was a small answer to a very large problem. But it was the beginning of something much bigger. About 1,000 years ago, the Dutch stopped only hiding from the water. They started fighting back. Instead of raising single hills, communities began drawing long lines across the land, earth walls built to protect whole communities. These were the first dikes, built to hold back rivers and the sea. Behind a dike, a village no longer needed a hill at all. But there was a problem. A dike keeps water out. It does nothing about the water already trapped inside: rain, river water, and water that seeps up through the soil. This is where the country's most famous machine enters the story. We picture Dutch windmills grinding grain into flour. But many of the windmills that shaped the Dutch landscape did something else entirely. These windmills were not built to make flour. They were machines for lifting water. A turning windmill drove a wheel or a screw. This lifted water from the low, wet fields, over the dike, into a canal, and out toward the sea. This is the polder, a low area enclosed by dikes, where the water level is controlled by canals and pumps. The work of managing the water never stops. Stop maintaining the pumps and canals, and the land begins to turn wet again. From the late Middle Ages onward, the Dutch used this method to drain entire lakes. Rows of windmills worked in a chain, each one lifting water a little higher than the last. Where lakes once stood, farms and villages appeared instead. One such lake was Haarlemmermeer. Decades after the lake was drained, part of its former lakebed became the site of Schiphol Airport. Today, Schiphol is one of the busiest airports in Europe. You can still see this old water machine at work today. At Kinderdijk, 19 historic windmills still stand within a much larger system of canals, dikes, and reservoirs. The site is now protected as a World Heritage Site. But holding back water was never only a technical problem. One weak stretch of dike could flood an entire community. Everyone depended on everyone else. so villages formed their own local water boards. They are among the oldest forms of local government still active in the country today. Each was led by an official called the dijkgraaf, the chair of the water board. For centuries, local communities could be required to provide labor, money, or materials to maintain the dikes. This need to cooperate later became part of Dutch political culture. People forced to negotiate because water does not care who is right. No one gave them this land. They built it, one dike, one polder at a time. There is one more story we need to clear up here, the most famous dike story of all. Many people believe an old Dutch legend tells of a boy who found a leak in a dike. He pushed his finger into the hole and held back the sea alone through the night. It is a moving image. But it is not Dutch at all. That boy came from a 19th century American children's book, not from traditional Dutch folklore. Real Dutch water safety never depended on one finger. It depended on thousands of ordinary people, maintaining an entire system, generation after generation. By now, it looked like the Dutch had won their 1,000-year argument with the sea. But every triumph carried a hidden cost. Drained peat does not stay still. Once exposed to air, it dries out, shrinks, and sinks. The more successfully the Dutch drained their land, the lower that land sank below the surrounding water. And the lower it sank, the harder the pumps had to work, just to keep it dry. They had not defeated the water. They had built a country that could never stop working. For centuries, this system held. Dikes were repaired. Pumps kept turning. Then came one winter night when it did not hold at all. On the night of January 31st into February 1st, 1953, a powerful storm swept in from the North Sea, arriving close to high tide. Violent winds drove the surge higher and higher against the coast. Along the southwest of the country, many dikes were old and too low, in a country still focused on rebuilding after the war. In the darkness, the water broke through in dozens of places at once. It poured into sleeping villages before anyone could raise an alarm. Families woke to find icy water rising through their bedrooms. Some climbed to rooftops and chimneys, waiting for help that could not always reach them in time. Old brick houses, never built to survive the force of waves, collapsed, taking whole families with them. Telephone lines went down. Many towns were completely cut off, not even knowing how many other communities were flooding around them. Through that long, freezing night, amateur radio operators became a lifeline, relaying emergency messages when telephone lines failed. Fishermen took out their boats. Soldiers and rescue workers moved into the flooded areas. Help came from across the country, and eventually from around the world. By the time the full scale of the disaster was known, more than 1,800 people had died in the Netherlands. Tens of thousands of animals had drowned. Tens of thousands more people were forced from their homes, and vast areas of farmland lay under salt water. It was in this chaos that one small act would be remembered for generations. At Nieuwerkerk aan den IJssel, a breach opened in a dike, protecting one of the most densely populated parts of the country. Water rushed through the opening, threatening cities that were home to millions of people. The local mayor made a desperate decision. He asked a barge captain named EraSpeak to do the impossible. Evegroen's ship was an old grain barge called the Gebroeders, Two Brothers. The mayor wanted him to steer it straight into the breach and let it become part of the dike itself. Evegroen agreed. He guided the barge into the gap, where it blocked much of the rushing water. The ship alone could not stop the disaster, but it slowed the flow of water just enough. It gave the people working on the dike the one thing they desperately needed: time. Time to pile sandbags. Time to hold the line until the worst of the storm had passed. No one gave them the land back. They built it again, with sandbags, an old grain barge, and their own hands. When the water finally fell, the Netherlands faced a hard question. Should it repair the old system or rebuild the country's entire defense? Within weeks, the government created the Delta Commission. Its mission was clear: make sure such a disaster could never happen again, whatever it cost. This commission gave birth to one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the world, the Delta Works. Over the following decades, the Dutch built a new line of massive barriers. They shortened much of the exposed coastline with dams, sluices, and movable storm barriers. Two of these structures stand out. The first is the Oosterschelde Barrier, a 9-kilometer structure with dozens of movable steel gates. Most of the time, the gates remain open and the tide flows through. During dangerous storms, they close. Engineers originally planned to seal the inlet completely, as they had done elsewhere. But fishermen and a young environmental movement fought back. They warned that a solid dam would destroy the plants and animals that depended on the tide. It would also hurt the local fishing economy. The result was a costly compromise. The barrier stays open most of the time, letting the tide move freely. It closes its gates only when a dangerous storm approaches. The second landmark is the Maaslandkering, protecting the massive port of Rotterdam. Two enormous gates rest in docks on opposite sides of the river. Each is connected to a giant steel arm, almost as long as the Eiffel Tower is tall. When the computer system predicts dangerously high water, the gates swing out from both sides of the river. They meet in the middle and sink to the riverbed, closing the route from the sea. Because the barrier protects both a major city and one of Europe's busiest ports, its closing system is fully automatic. The Delta Works also changed how the Dutch measured safety itself. Some densely populated areas were designed around an annual flood probability as low as 1 in 10,000. Today, Dutch policy has gone even further. It no longer only calculates the chance of a flood. It also considers how many lives would be at risk if a flood happened. It was, in every sense, a new promise, written not only in policy, but in concrete and steel. But even before the Delta Works, the Dutch had already attempted something almost unimaginable. In the north, a shallow inland sea, called the Zuiderzee, had threatened the country's heart for centuries. In the early 20th century, the Dutch decided to close it completely. They built a dike 32 kilometers long, sealing the sea away and slowly turning it into a freshwater lake. Fishing communities had depended on the saltwater sea for generations. As it slowly became a freshwater lake, their lives changed deeply and painfully. Urk, once an island in the Zota Sea, became connected to the new polderland around it. But it kept its identity as a fishing community on the shore of the new lake, the IJsselmeer. On the drained seabed itself, the Dutch built something new, the Flevopolder, often described as the world's largest artificial island. Archaeologists working there found the remains of ships that had once sunk in the waters of the old Zuiderzee. They now rest quietly beneath farmland and roads. It stood as the final triumph of an old philosophy. If water stood in the way, the answer was to remove it and build on what was left behind. But in recent decades, the Dutch have made a turn nobody expected. They have begun giving some of that hard-won land back to the water. A changing climate is raising sea levels and making storms and river floods more dangerous. Engineers realized that endlessly raising dikes was not the only answer. Rivers also needed more space to carry extreme water safely. So a new philosophy took shape, not to fight the water at every point, but to negotiate with it. Under a program called Room for the River, the Dutch changed the landscape in dozens of places. Some dikes were moved back. Floodplains were lowered, and new channels gave rivers more space to spread safely during high water. In cities like Rotterdam, some plazas and parks are designed to flood on purpose. During heavy rain, they turn into temporary lakes, then drain safely afterward. Some Dutch homes now float permanently on the water, while others rise along tall guideposts whenever the water level increases. Along the coast, engineers built something called the sand motor, one enormous artificial sandbank. After it was placed, waves, wind, and currents began spreading the sand naturally along the shore, feeding beaches for years to come. No one simply gave them this land. They raised it with baskets. They drained it with windmills. They defended it with barriers. And today, they are still building it by making room for water. The Dutch did not survive because they finally defeated nature. They survived because they kept changing the way they lived with it. Today, Dutch engineers and water experts work with flood-prone cities around the world, from the United States to Southeast Asia. When coastal cities search for ways to live with rising water, Dutch engineers are often part of the conversation. If you enjoyed learning how the Netherlands built its own land, like this video and subscribe for more history told in clear English.